Tonight's last lecture of the semester, so we will dive right in and go as far as we get. I say we, that's very polite, as far as I get. You guys would probably go a lot faster. Let me just sort of try to do some summary tonight on this passage, and then when we come back, we'll go into the next section that has to do with the bodhisattvas that come to this assembly. We're looking at that section of text. I think it's page 7. I don't have my copy, but it's because of the spiritual power of the Buddha in each of the 10 directions. There was a great bodhisattva who, together with bodhisattvas to the number of fine motes of dust in 10 Buddha lands, came to the Buddha's place. That's the section we're looking at. And then we're talking about a number of themes here. One is that they come to this place because they're responding to a light that's emitted of the Buddha, and they have enough light within their own cultivation of their bodies and minds so that they're very responsive to this. And we went over how this is not the case, that just because the light's emitted, everybody has a response. And I'll go into that a little bit tonight again. And we were talking about 2 dimensions, but I came up with a third. You give me enough time, I'll come up with a fourth. But 2 dimensions why people don't respond to this light, respond to this sound, respond to the images, respond to a number of things. For example, a meditation retreat that's being offered. Why, if there's a meditation retreat being offered of a 7-day chi, some people come, some people don't. Some people don't even know about it, therefore they can't come, but they're not knowing about it as part of the causes and conditions that we live within. So what we know and see at any one time isn't just simply an access issue. It's a disposition, character issue. And so if there's enough disposition, enough character, then even the subtlest of messages we pick up on. If that's not the case, even if you were to take prime time on TV and say, oh, at the City of 10,000 Buddhas, there's an Amitabha session going on, and you even did it during the football games on the weekends, you would probably still not have any more response as if you just said it word to mouth. And that's because the way the Dharma works is that without this prior base of potential or affinities, there isn't going to be a connection to this. It's very interesting. So we talked about 2 things that can obstruct, and we put these into classical terms: the obstruction of klesha and also the obstruction of what is known. These are the 2 major, and we talked about klesha largely being that of trishna, which is desire. And so the counteracting of this is basically to acknowledge where it is that we're driven by thirst, not necessarily aspirations or even wholesome longings or desires, but driven by thirst for these 3 karma, bhava, and vibhava, and we went over what that was. And then there's a wonderful passage that I used from the Daodejing that basically says, when we truck with or merge with desires, we only see the surface of things. This is an actual passage from the Daodejing. Free from desire, we see what's really truly there. They call it in the Daodejing mystery, but mystery just means the profound, what is most profoundly operating below the appearance of things. But caught in these thirst, we only see the manifestation. Then we went on to talk about this obstruction of what is known, and I just wanted to share a little more of the Western material because some people seem to like that. So, and it doesn't happen very much anymore. It's sort of generally a part of a basic liberal arts education, which is becoming as threatened with extinction as dodo birds and dinosaurs and perhaps even the planet these days. It's just an endangered species. So I wanted to do 2 passages One is from a poet about 1700 that when I first encountered, I liked. I don't know why. I encountered him through my grandmother. My grandmother was a school teacher and was determined to tame and subdue me because I was a pretty wild child. And she had this wonderful library in her house, and she'd have me come over, make me come over, order me to come over, and scrub her floors and do her windows, and then choose some book from the library that she had, and I'd have to read her a passage and talk about it. My earliest education. Now, I'm very happy that she did that now. Then I was not a happy camper. But nonetheless, this is from a poet called Alexander Pope. This is written about 1700. And it's an essay on man, or on the human. And here he really hits, in the same way a Buddhist or even the Taoist or the Confucian text hit upon the humbleness we need to, or should have as people about what we think we know. And this is a constant struggle. And it gets almost ironically, as we gain more access to knowledge, the wisdom of the humility that says we still know far less. There's far more that we don't know than what we do know. And yet, each generation, each age feels they're right on the cusp of the total compass of knowledge. We always feel like we're on the cutting edge. No one knows as much. So this is a cautionary poem. He's describing the human, and I'm just going to quote this slowly for you. He describes people as kind of hanging between two poles of tension. One way he describes it, and this is what Pascal as well does, he says man, or the human, is caught between the infinitely small, the microscopic, down to where it almost seems to disappear into just fields of possibilities, and the macroscopic, the infinitely large. And we're in between those two, and we can't quite figure out where we are in terms of the infinitely vast and the infinitely small. And the cautionary thing here is to see ourselves not as the supreme, primary, special created being that overlords and looks over everything, but in a web of interrelated, of which we may not be, actually, the best, the brightest, and, anyhow. And so this Pope goes on with this theme. He says, he, meaning humans, hangs between, in doubt to act or rest, in doubt to deem himself a god or beast. This is us. In doubt his mind or body to prefer. Born to die, reasoning but to err. So these are the first four lines. We hang between whether we should act or not act, we don't know. For example, we come up with possibilities with our science and technology. Should we because we can? Or should we not? Because what could happen? And so we don't know to act or rest. In doubt to deem ourselves God or beast. Sometimes humans can rise to almost the sagely or saintly, and at the same time can sink to a depravity that even beasts themselves don't rise to. Those two lines. In doubt his mind or body to prefer. This is the unfortunate split we have between mind-body, between matter and spirit, or between science and religion, where we're split between our mind or body to prefer, as if they were two distinct realms, and we go back and forth. Sometimes we're rational, intellectual, and other times we're just following almost primal desires that are not informed. And this one is born to die and reasoning but to err. This tension there. We're born only to die, and we reason and we think only to come up with mistakes. And then it goes on. Alike in ignorance, his reason such, whether he thinks too little or too much. And so it doesn't matter how much we put into this. Alike in ignorance and his reason, whether he thinks too little or too much. Chaos of thought and passion. Chaos of thought and passion all confused. still by himself abused or disabused. Created half to rise and half to fall. Great Lord of all things, yet prey to all. By the way, the prey to all is really, we feel ourselves to be at the top of the food chain, great Lord of all things, and yet, at the micro level, going back to Pascal's thing, we are vulnerable to the smallest of things. I was just reading this fascinating article on the history of mosquitoes in humans. It's really a powerful narrative about how mosquitoes have been probably one of the primary determining factors of a lot of human history we never thought about in those terms. In terms of the diseases they bring, in terms of the control they've had in bringing armies to literally dead stillness, unable to pursue. I could share this with you at another time, but it's really fascinating. Just the tiny little mosquito. And it's sort of like great Lord of all things, yet prey to all. On the microbacterial level, we are now increasingly resistant to antibiotics. And so, again, there's movements to reduce the overuse of antibiotics, especially with animals. But the result has been we've overused them so much is that we now have resistance to the antibiotics that we thought were the breakthrough. Alike in ignorance is reason such, thinks too little too much. You can just see, and this is 1700. I mean, this is really quite brilliant for this time. Sole judge of truth in endless error hurled, the glory, jest, and riddle of the world. This is Pope. Then, at this time, he makes a little stab at the area that is emerging as the new font of knowledge, which is science, and the beginning of science. And so he takes a little poke at science. He says, go, wondrous creature. Go, wondrous creature. Mount where science guides. Mount the horse of science and just follow it. Go measure the earth, weigh the air, and state the tides. Instruct the planets in what orbs to run. Correct old time and regulate the sun. And then he ends with this line, go teach eternal wisdom how to rule, then drop into thyself and be a fool. And so he's saying, yes, you have this expansive knowledge of that, but your knowledge of this, you drop into yourself and you still don't understand the human, what it means. Anyhow, I wanted to share that with you because it's a wonderful kind of cautionary to the hubris part that we were talking about. And then I'll just share with you another one. This also from a text I like a great deal, the Daodejing, which I think is probably the most translated into different languages, especially English, of any Chinese philosophical text. Does anybody know? I think I have seen more translations of this with different titles, going back to the late 1800s, 1900s, still coming out. I have a colleague at Brown who's going to do yet another translation of the Daodejing. Daodejing literally means, anybody? Dao is way. I don't know. Dao, da, virtue, and then text. So it's text of way virtue. That's one way to translate it. Or the text of the power of virtue, or the text of the power of the way. This one is a cautionary tale from the Daodejing on knowledge. And I'll just read it. To know when one does not know is best. To think one knows when one does not know is a dire disease. Only someone who recognizes this disease as a disease can cure himself or herself of the disease. The sage's way of curing disease also consists in making people recognize their diseases as diseases and thus cease to be diseased. So this one is the cautionary tale. Go and try to get the knowledge, try to acquire, but at the same time realize that you may not know all that you think, and this knowledge may only be like a grain of sand on a mountain of possibilities. Okay. Now, I came up with a third one. And I'm sorry I did this, I guess, but it occurred to me because I was reading commentary from my teacher. And in this particular section on the commentary on the Avatamsaka, it's going to sound similar to something else I shared with you, but it's a little bit different. And he's saying again, there's a tendency with these sutras, especially like the Avatamsaka, to think this is beyond us. This is not about us. This is about Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. It's about this great realm removed from the human. And he always insisted and always lectured in such a fashion that the human, and particularly us humans in the audience, where we were at that moment, was deeply interconnected with this text that is timeless. And so here's the commentary he was giving at this time. He said, the Buddha spoke or lectured these sutras to enable each of us to live good lives, proper and regular lives, lives very much in accord with Sila. This has to do with morality and ethics. That is why he spoke all of the Dharma doors and lectured all the sutras. Each sutra is presenting us with a proper road along which to travel. However, and here's what I want to stress tonight, we must go along it for the sutras to be of use. If we only know the sutras and do not rely on the sutras to cultivate, then we can listen to the sutras for 80,000 great kalpas, but it'll be the equivalent of not having heard them at all. And so this is in response to the line I read you last week where he says they had eyes but could not see Nishanda Buddha, they had ears but could not hear the sudden perfect teaching. He's moving into another level here. He's actually saying, besides the obstruction of the thirst and desires which cloud us over, and besides the obstruction of what is known, there's yet a third obstruction. And this goes into how do you recover the meaning of these texts? And his emphasis here is you have to practice, you actually have to cultivate. It's not just an intellectual exercise. In other words, you have to change who you are in order to counter what this is, if that makes sense. You can't encounter and understand what this is except through a dialogue or a dialectic, if you will, where you're reading the text and you're letting the text pressure and push on you to change and correct and become a better person. And by doing that, the meaning of the text then opens up. And it's this reciprocal back and forth that's going on. And when I saw this, I really wanted to share that with you because this indeed was the energy or the emphasis of being in his presence when he was teaching us. He would lecture these incredibly deep and brilliant, complicated texts like the Avatamsaka, yet right within the lecture, before the lecture, after the lecture, living with him in the monastery, the constant pressure, the energy was not so much on understanding that text, but looking at and understanding this oneself. And so I shared this with you before, but a lot of the teaching had to do with things you might consider kind of mundane or trivial, had to do with our personalities and our character and our habits and our tendencies along these lines. And he would be really right on that to say, this is in fact what the sutras are pointing to. These are the impediments or obstacles you need to cultivate in order to actually open up your own wisdom. It's not mysterious. It's not like it's a divine gift. It's really a jewel within you, but you have to rub and polish. And the way you rub and polish is exactly where you don't want to go. It's into those bad habits and faults. And so at that time, I'm not going to give you a laundry list of the bad habits and faults of us who are coming in. And if I did, I'd probably exclude my own. So, but it's the stuff that is still around. It's the pettiness and the fighting and the competitiveness to either be number one in the world or number one intellectually or number one socially, most popular, or number one cultivator, number one monk or nun in the monastery. Be the apple of the abbot's eye, sort of thing. So competing for that, trying to outshine each other. If you memorize one page, I can memorize two. You memorize the book, I'll memorize three. You sit for 45 minutes, I'll sit for an hour. You sit for an hour, I'll sit for an hour and a half. On and on and on. So that kind of competitiveness and fighting to be number one There was a lot of that. A lot of attachments to what's called kama, the sensual desires, food, fame, wealth, sex, various forms of sleep, drugs, alcohol. Oh, alcohol is universal, it's always been around. Drugs come and go, different kinds of drugs. In the 60s, there were some, I know you're gonna be shocked, there were some drugs in the 60s, and some people were using them. There was a lot of sort of, I would call anarchistic or just anti-authoritarian behavior for the sake of just pushing against the system, the way things were set up. There was quite a bit going on. On top of that, there was more of these deeply universal ones that each of us maybe had: pride, arrogance, envy, and jealousy, a lack of vigor to the point of being really lazy, hoping that somebody else would do it for her. And all of these things he would just, and of course, one of the bigger ones was anger. And it could be from mild irritation to full-blown rage. And ironically, you'd think, well, when people come to live together in a monastery, they're just like, good morning, how are you? You know, it's really, no, there was somehow the incubation, the energy, he called it a foundry, where you put in raw elements and then you cook it up, and as you smelt it, all the dross and stuff comes to the surface. That's what cultivation does. So a monastery, a lot of my parents, for example, thought, well, you're just going there to escape the world and reality. I wasn't, but I thought that's not a bad idea, because escaping the world is, but you don't. Actually, you actually encounter it more directly, because you encounter your part of it, which is most of what reality is. And so in the monastery, you're really in a house of mirrors. It's not a house of windows where you're looking at everybody else, but it's actually a house of mirrors. And so this can be uncomfortable. It can be bittersweet, more bitter than sweet. And he would up the fire. And so if you had, you'd be to bed early, you'd be up early, you had your schedule filled, so there wasn't much room to divert or distract. And without those divertissements of getting out, that fire just cooked and cooked. And then you were given opportunities to show your virtues. I'm joking. You get opportunities to show your faults and bad habits, whether it was greed for power or wanting to be number one. He had ways of setting you up so that you could manifest those and then see them. In any event, what he meant by practice or cultivating was to work on this dimension. Not on the metaphysical, not on the abstract, but to actually work on the immediate, right before us, human. And somehow the atmosphere of cultivation requires then an almost, a brutal honesty of being willing to say, okay, I'm here to do that, I'm here to look at that. If that's not the case, it's a waste of time. If you're really not here to look at those aspects and cultivate them and refine them and change them, then it might be interesting to listen to some of these things, and it might be kind of interesting to read the text, but it's not going to have the purchase it's supposed to have. It's not going to really open up unless there's a corresponding change and letting go on one's own. So this is why so much emphasis was put there, because he was actually going to the ground, the basic ground that obstructed all understanding was cultivating and smoothing out these kinks and wrinkles in our personalities. So this part is extremely important. There's a line that says, I hear and I forget. I see and I remember. I do and I understand. And this really applies to this kind of learning mode, is you can hear something and then minutes later, sometimes even seconds later, you don't remember it. You can see it and there's some recollection or memory, but only in doing it is there understanding. And I think this is what probably the master is getting at in his commentary here, is that in the actual doing of cultivation, you will understand the text. And without the actual doing, there'll be no understanding. And you won't, not only will remember it, but you'll probably forget it. So this one you see throughout. It's one of the reasons I like the Platform Sutra so much, because Hui Neng is constantly stressing this point. For example, when he says, this must be practiced, he uses practice, and I think it's the character Xing, which means like xiuxing. Xing means to do, to walk, to practice. Must be practiced with the mind, not merely recited with the mouth. Verbal repetition without mental cultivation is like a fantasy, a hallucination, as dewdrops and a lightning flash. I'm quoting right from the text. However, while the mouth recites, the mind practices, then mind and mouth both are in accord. One's essential nature is Buddha. Apart from this nature, there is no other Buddha. So this is the sixth patriarch, Hui Neng, really talking about this. And some of you remember, I won't go into the text a great deal, but he talks about this again and again, about the difference between talking and walking, essentially. And you can talk wonderfully, you can talk well, but if you don't walk, it's still not the way, it's not the Tao. And then he says, if you do that, if you don't let your mind expand by getting rid of these habits and faults, you sink down into a petty, mean existence. Sort of what T.S. Eliot says, I've measured out my life in coffee spoons. And he says, the mind has a capacity for great things. It's not meant to behave in petty ways. Do not talk about prajna and emptiness all day long and fail to cultivate it in your minds. That would be like a commoner proclaiming himself the king of the country. How absurd this could never be. Then he says, I'm always asking people to realize the knowledge and vision of a Buddha within themselves, within their own minds, and so on and so forth. And then he says, let's see, this is a wonderful line. Oh, if you talk about it all day without realizing the prajna of their own essential nature, this is just as talking about food will not satisfy hunger. Wow. Now, what I found was, I gave a lecture a couple weeks ago, and I wanted, because it was about Buddhism, and the professor really wanted to do something on poetry, and then I forgot to do this, and I wanted to do this, so now I'm going to do it tonight. This is how my mind works, it circles back. But we were talking about how sutra texts can inspire poetry. So many of the poems that are coming out of the sort of the Chan tradition, their connection, their allusions go back to these texts. Yajnadatta, for example, we talked about this, the guy who saw his face in the mirror and said, everybody has a head, where's mine? And then he went to the madman and went out. This parallel, cooking sand, hoping to get rice and so forth. These are from the Shurangama. You have these illusions. Dream illusion, bubble shadows from the Vajra Sutra. And poems have been written about this. So the poem I found that I wanted to share tonight. So when is Hui Neng? Anybody remember his time? He lived, the Tang Dynasty is about, don't Google it, just see if you can. 500. And just guessing is okay, I guess, these days. Anybody else more precise? Tang Dynasty. Hui Neng. Huh? You think 500? 500. Actually, a little later, but you're in the ballpark.
Just 650.
Yeah, I would say more like the late 600s and 700. In any event, this poem and this poet comes 150 years later. So as this text gets out and gets known, passages of it then work their way into poetry. And this is from Han Shan, Coal Mountain Han Shan, in his poem. And this poem, actually, I think, it comes from Hui Neng, because Han Shan's in that Chan tradition. So Han Shan, when the master writes or says, and it's recorded, good and wise friends, people chant prajna all day long without realizing the prajna of their own essential nature. Just as talking about food will not satisfy hunger, so too only talking about emptiness and prajna for myriad of eons will give you no insight into your own nature. Ultimately, it's of no benefit. So here's the poem. It starts, talking about food won't make you full. So you can see the connection. He goes back to the sixth patriarch, says, talking about food will not satisfy hunger. He just, same thing, talking about food won't satisfy your hunger. But then he goes on with this, and it's beautiful how he poetically moves it. Babbling about clothes won't keep out the cold. A bowl of rice is what fills the belly, and it takes a suit of clothing to make you warm. So he takes food and clothes. And yet, now he goes into the second part of the poem, without stopping to consider this truth, that you eat, you're full, you put, of course, clothes on, and you're warm, and of course, you go to bed and you sleep and you're rested. Let's take them food, clothes, sleep. Or you're sick and you take medicine and you're better. These are really pragmatic things. Without considering this, in other words, the nature of how things work, you complain the Buddha is hard to find. So he's saying, you food, clothes, sleep, medicine, so forth, you figure that out, and yet why do you complain the Buddha's hard to find? He said, turn your mind within. There is the Buddha. Why are you looking outside? And that's the end of the poem. So in a sense, he takes Huineng's inspiration of the food thing and then renders it into this poem. I don't know the Chinese for this. I think if we had that, it'd be wonderful to hear it, because the Chinese then would be rendered in this rhythmic kind of way. This then is what Huineng calls, and that's what I'm calling the third obstacle. And the third obstacle is what he calls disembodied wisdom. Disembodied wisdom. In other words, it's not embodied. It's not really taken in and cultivated, but it's merely held intellectually, or even worse, on your computer. It exists. You got all the sutras and everything's there, you collected them, or you have this fine collection and you're willing to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for a Tripitaka collection from so-and-so dynasty, but you never open it. And he says, saying that it's like collecting menus and never eating. So what? So then the question is, what are these texts for? They're meant to be absorbed, they're meant to be digested and embodied. And in fact, one of the ways of giving, which is a form of cultivation, is practicing giving. It's not only kind words and beneficial deeds and so forth, but there's a giving called literally manifesting body to speak Dharma. In other words, embodiment. That you become the embodiment of the teaching in your thoughts and your actions and your words, and that's an act of giving. That's the deepest kind of charity. So I'm just going into this because it's, to me, we could overlook this third element of saying what obstructs the ability to understand and receive these teachings is in fact the effort on our part not to cultivate, not to really actually just prepare the ground. Any questions on that? Is that? Yes, Connie.
Why is cultivating an act of giving?
Why is cultivating an act of giving?
Yeah, like what
You didn't hear what I just said?
I did, but like it's still, you know, can you elaborate on why? So, I mean, besides like the dedicating, okay, is that
Do you, if you cultivate, or somebody close to you really is cultivating, don't you feel as if they're giving you something?
kind of like? Sometimes I don't know. Well, I mean, it's
Think about it. Yeah, think about it. The Avatamsaka has this wonderful passage. It says there's giving of material things, there's giving of kind words, there's giving of courage or fearlessness. There's giving by reducing your share, which is a really interesting form of giving. In other words, your footprint on the planet, if you reduce your share of what you take and use, is a form of giving. It's very interesting. It's ancient text. But it says of all these forms of giving, the gift of Dharma is the highest gift. And of the gift of Dharma, the highest gift of that is embodying it and not simply speaking it. So that if you embodied it even without speaking it, if you were a person of the way, a cultivated, complete person, that's what I think you could translate the shunza, is a completed person, accomplished person. That is an incredible gift. And to run into somebody who's even beginning their cultivation, much less advanced, has a profound influence on those who draw near, those who contact. A child that cultivates in this way gives far more back to their parents than setting aside something else for them in their retirement of food and clothing and medicine and so forth. So this kind of gift, the embodiment, is probably the highest form. And one of the reasons is it's just so real. To actually meet someone who's really cultivating is so deeply inspirational. It's like a light and energy you get that makes you a wholly different person having encountered them. Which is why when you read the biographies and autobiographies of people who are cultivating, it's that encounter, even before words are spoken, that has the transformative effect. In the light of their virtue, something happens that's really quite powerful. And people are very smart. If you're not cultivating, if you're not really sincere, they see through it. You can try to put on a show, but it's not going to work. And so this gift, this sincerely embodying it, is so powerful that alone caused the Buddha to go on his path. And when the Buddha got that, it caused the four that he gave the next teaching to go on their path. And you see, time after time, the inspired tradition gets passed along through the embodied, not the disembodied. So this becomes really important. Understanding and cultivating one line of text is probably better than not cultivating a whole sutra and memorizing it, which is, I'm just paraphrasing. So this is why the Sixth Patriarch says these texts and these teachings in here are methods of practice, are not subjects of debate. So the embodiment has to do, you just take them up and practice. You don't have an endless debate about, is Chan better than Pure Land or whatnot. Yes?
So you're saying that these texts are kind of, you allow them to kind of, you take them to change yourself. So the first step in some ways, you're taking it as a hypothesis. How would you allow that to trust the text to take that action, or that have that confidence to actually change yourself?
You mean, how would you trust the text?
Yes. Or have the faith, basically.
What I'm trying to describe is a sort of a reciprocal, mutually dialectic. You start with some hypothesis, some trust, and then you enact it. For example, you just say, it says Shila is the root, okay? So I'm going to take a couple precepts. I'm going to take 5 precepts. You make that initial action, and then you observe how are you different by holding those 5 precepts? And if the theory is right, things should get better in your life. Your priorities should become more clear. Your relationships with other people should be improved. There should be less friction and so on and so forth. And your self-assessment, your idea of your self-worth and your integrity should start to naturally fill itself up, and it becomes then rewarded through the return of the action. That should allow you then to say, that's interesting. What if I went further along these lines and deepened my holding of the precepts, not only with my body, but with my mouth and my mind as well? And then you go back and forth. And that's what the Buddha said, my teaching at the beginning, the middle, and end is sweet. It has the taste of honey. So it doesn't matter what stage you are, there should be a return coming from practice. And you practice, take one of the paramitas of giving. We're talking about all these ways, reducing my share, giving through fearlessness and so forth. And you actually feel yourself as the laboratory. You're the scientist and the subject, and you're the whole experiment. See what the results are. It's very pragmatic. It's very pragmatic. And if you know these results, you know that flavor, you just keep going on and on. So the text informs you, but your practice validates the text, which then allows the text to inform you more. There's more trust, more experience, more trust, more experience. And finally, that's what cultivation is. It's this theory, practice, confidence, conviction, validation, more confidence, more da-da-da-da-da. Does that make sense? But without some initial gesture to change, to try something like the precepts, nothing's going to happen. You're just like, I'm waiting for the Buddha. Okay. You're waiting for food, you're not going out to eat. That kind of thing. So this becomes a really important element. And I would say in this thing, where it says because of the Buddha's spiritual power, we should not be misreading this to say it is solely because of the Buddha's spiritual power that these events are happening. I'm suggesting the reciprocity here. Because these bodhisattvas are cultivating, when the Buddha's spiritual power is released, they can respond. But it's not always the case that there's going to be a response for everybody. We went over this. Here, let me just read this section. And this is from, I'll use this throughout as long as I'm doing the Avatamsaka lectures, is Qingliang Goshi's Su Chao. And this is from the Su Chao. And he says, this response to the Buddha's light, this response that one has when you cultivate, it accords with what he calls the stimulus of potentials. In other words, potentials stimulated. The light is released because the Buddha is responding to potentials in living beings. Otherwise, there'd be no action-reaction. That is, although from past causes the Dharma, which is that way, is constant and pervasive, permitting the flow of transmission, still there must be stimulus of potentials. For the Dharma spoken apart from potentials is useless. This is a really powerful line. If you don't speak these teachings in accord with potentials, it's useless. It has to be appropriate to the potentials and the affinities and understandings and biases of that audience. If it's spoken apart from these potentials, it's useless. That is, as when above there is a full moon which can make distinct a pool of water below. When there's a full moon, you can see this wonderful pool of water below. For me in Maine, this is wonderful. And when there's a full moon in Maine and you go out, the lake is just totally illuminated right to the shores because there's very little light pollution, no cities around. If the water in the pool is clear, then reflections will appear. I want to emphasize this. It's when the moon is full, can make the water appear. Only if the pool is clear, then reflections appear. If the water is murky, there's junk and stuff on the top, you won't be able to see it. So too with the stimulus of potentials, the response arises. So in other words, even if there is this happening, and apparently it's happening, one shouldn't be seeking for this kind of magical thing to happen. It happens only when your potentials start to mature and ripen. Okay. I'm going to take, well, you any more questions? And then I'll tell you a story.
What determines the potential?
What's that?
What determines the potential?
Hard work, vows, patience, sincerity. If you cultivate your own ground, then the smallest of seeds blowing by will sit and, but if you don't, even if you put primary seeds on there, nothing's going to happen. So potentials is referring to your cultivation, your person. Are you fertile? Are you open? Are you transforming? Are you becoming a Dharma vessel? How do you become a Dharma vessel? Get rid of the garbage. It's not like you have to go make a vessel. You already are. So the potentials is this capacity to receive, the capacity to be open. And that means emptying out. That's why it says in this Tao, the only motion of returning is coming back. And the emptying out is the creating of the potentials. So here's a story. I've told some before. You'll be bored if you heard it before, but I'll tell you again because it's a story that happened to me. Back in the 70s, I was interested in trying to cultivate, and I looked at a number of different places. Nothing resonated. There wasn't that kind of response. I even went to Asia for a couple of years, and nothing happened there. So then I came back, and I decided, well, I'll just continue to do Tai Chi and things like that and see if that will. And so, make a long story short, I was working out, exercising every morning. We'd do it about 5 o'clock down at the Tai Chi studio. And then one morning, someone had put up a poster on the Tai Chi studio board a very strange poster. It was the image of Guanyin Bodhisattva, the one that's at the city of 10,000 Buddhas, so it has that 1,000 hands, 1,000 eyes. Each hand has an eye in it. You know, it's huge. I don't know, we have an image here of it. I don't know. Yeah, it's sort of like that one there, like that one there. You see that one? I'm pointing to the second one from the end here at the left. That's a 1,000-eye, 1,000-hand Guanyin Bodhisattva. So, and then below it was a picture of monks and nuns at Gold Mountain Monastery, which was on 15th Street in San Francisco at the time. And the image of Guanyin was really impressive. The monks and nuns were not. They looked really stoic and bitter. Shaved heads, gray robes on, sitting in meditation facing a wall. And you could just tell by looking, the food wasn't good and it wasn't heated. It was not plush. And yet, right below it was announcing that there was going to be a session, a Daodejing they called it, which was reciting the Great Compassion Mantra for 7 days, occurring at the monastery, and you could apply to go. And then there was a little verse, and the verse says, 1,000 eyes see all, 1,000 ears hear all, 1,000 hands help and support living beings everywhere. And when I read that line, I kind of got a chill up my spine, almost, you know, a little watery in my eyes. I thought, wow, what's that about? So I just went outside and I was doing my Shaolin and stuff like that, and I thought, I'm going to go back and look at that poster again, see what's... So I looked at it again, and I read the verse, 1,000 eyes see all, ears hear all, 1,000 hands help and support living beings everywhere. And this time, actually, tears started to come to my eyes. And I was like, why am I having this response? So I was going to be very scientific about this. I was going to go out, do some more Shaolin and Tai Chi and whatnot, and try it for a third time. And then I said, if it happens a third time, I better go check this place out, even though it doesn't look that inviting. And so I went out, looked at it, did my standing meditation, came back in, read it a third time, and the tears were just flowing. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go. And I turned to a person who was standing there and said, I'm going to go to this Gold Mountain place. He said, oh, God, don't go there. Why not? He says, it's cold, the food sucks. And he said, the worst part is they take the precepts seriously, man. I mean, like they really hold the precepts? Like, who does that, huh? I said, oh, okay, well. So I decided to go. And sure enough, I remember I pulled up, I came over in my pickup truck, my girlfriend dropped me off in front of the monastery, and right then, this tall Western monk came out of the door with a shaved head, a couple spots that were bleeding because he must have just shaved it. Looked totally weird. It was down in the Mission District on Valencia and 15th Street, that area. The projects were across the street, and I was like, what am I doing here? And I said, okay, I can do anything for a week. Anything for a week. I know I got 7 days, I'll just kick in for 7 days. So I came in, and as soon as I came in, it's funny, I really felt at home, even though it was very weird, and given my Catholic background, this was as close to the hells of paganism I was ever going to get. There were all these gilded images and icons, incense and people chanting and bowing to these foreign idols and so on and so forth. Never mind. So that night, the abbot asked everybody, he said, tonight is the beginning of the session. We have 5 or 6 new people here. Everybody tell their story, how they got here. And so 2 young women spoke up about, they were sisters, about how they got there. They became nuns. Another person spoke up, and finally he said, well, what about you? I said, well, you know, my first night, you want me to say something? I said, okay, so I'll tell you the story. I was at the Taiji studio. I saw this crazy poster. I read this line. I started crying. I did it 3 times, and I said, okay, I better go check it out. And so the master said, oh, he says, very interesting. Okay, let's go. And so after the lecture, we did the closing and whatnot, and then a couple people came up to me all excited, and they said, wow, it worked. It worked. I said, what are you talking about? They said, like, you know, you read that poster, right? I said, yeah. They said, well, the master, the abbot told us when we designed, they created the poster from scratch. They had the stencils and the whole thing and the photographs. And he said, while you're working on this poster, don't do what you always do, is like false thinking and outflow through your mouth and all this. Recite the Great Compassion Mantra sincerely and devotedly while you're working on this poster. Transfer the energy from the mantra into the poster. If you do it sincerely, the poster will generate a light and even a sound that will cause those who have affinities and potentials, like a beacon, to call them back. And they said, it worked. It worked. I said, you're here. and so it's like, I was thinking, wow, that's a really interesting thing. Could it be that light is released and those with potentials, however impoverished they might be, it doesn't just mean the Buddha sits there and emits light. It could be through the deeds of his disciples, of the people, of the sincerity, through images, through sounds, through posters and whatnot. There's an element of that light there. And that if you have those potentials, there's some kind of response. So I can't help but thinking with this passage that in a small way, my coming in was a response to an energy that they were putting out, of giving in a sense, that had some response. And otherwise, there's no way explaining how I ended up there that night except something. But they were convinced, and I don't think they were wrong, that it was almost like he's telling us to do this. This is superstition, but we'll do it anyhow. And then I show up, and these other four, and they're going, oh my gosh, it works, it works. So I'll end there on that story tonight. I don't know if you have any responses or questions about the story. It is what it is. That's just what happened. But it might be that something as simple as you being here tonight and somebody knowing about that kind of puts out a light of some sort, puts out a little vibe, a little beam. And other people kind of like, well, why are they there? What's that about? In a sense, what it is, it's part of releasing a kind of light that draws in. It doesn't have to be the spiritual powers of a Buddha. It can be simply, I went there, I've been there for a year, and I noticed you're not as angry as you used to be. Oh, okay. Well, that's a light. That's a little light you're releasing. And then you say, you only notice it now, stupid? Oops. And then the light goes out. Okay, we'll close. We'll pick up again towards the end of January. Ken, do you know the exact date yet?
Yeah, the last February. What's the last or January? 31st.
31st. Okay. So probably about 6 weeks to do whatever you do in 6 weeks. But we'll see you back here and we'll continue. And then we have some announcements. And
So we actually have right now the Chan starting, actually not right now. Right now the Amitabha session at CPTV, but the Chan will be starting, I think, Sunday night. People want to do that for 3 weeks, like the 16,000 Buddhas. Want to just
the
meditate for
Amitabha's
3 weeks.
ongoing now, right?
Yeah, Amitabha's just finishing.
It's cold, it's dark.
Yeah,
But it's great.
it's good. You can have. We have like maybe our posters. We're missing our.
This is our PR person. So come. It's cold and dark.
Ready to try it out.
And I was thinking the other thing to announce is Bhikkhu Bodhi, who's a really kind of well-known translator of Pali texts. If people have read any of the Pali canon, he's probably translated that text to the English. And he'll be coming to teach at DRBU on March 16th to the 27th, 2020. And we also have a week of a Guanyin session right before that, from probably March, I think probably 9th. 7th to the 12th. So if people would like to join that, you can go to the extension website, DRBU extension website, which is extension.drbu.edu. So you can sign up. This should be a good event.
And this is a perfect example of the back and forth where you have a period of study and a period of practice back to back. The study informs the practice reveals the study, and actually having an environment where that can happen, the same thing we do here. Tomorrow there'll be cultivation going on here through recitation and whatnot, and the evenings there's study, and that back and forth, that study practice, and then your own thing of just diving in and trusting it. Your question, Jason, makes the difference. So if you just come to the study and not practice, it's a little bit sterile. If you just do the practice and don't study, you'll end up going down a dark alley. It's kind of blind, but put them together and it works. So we'll see you all at the end of January, some of you before that. In passing, I usually run into people on the streets and whatnot. But take care of yourself, stay healthy, even if it's cold and dark. Actually, when it's cold and dark, that's not a bad time to do Chan, because there's just less external distractions, so it's much easier to return the light and illumine within. Okay, we'll do the transference in English. Because our hearts are one, this world